However, he hesitated. I rationalized my hesitation, stating to myself that I didn't really know all the details of Islam and that my areas of agreement were confined to the general concepts. So I continued to read and reread. The sense of identity, the sense of who one is a powerful affirmation of one's position in the cosmos. In my professional practice, occasionally I was called upon to deal with certain disorders related to addictions, ranging from smoking, alcoholism, to drug abuse, drug use. As a clinician, I knew that basic physical addiction had to be overcome to create initial abstinence. That was the easy part of the treatment. As Mark Twain once said, quitting smoking is easy. I did that hundreds of times. However, he also knew that the key to maintaining the abstinence for a prolonged period of time was to overcome psychological addiction of the client, which was strongly rooted in their basic sense of identity, or i.e., the customer identified himself as a smoker or as a drunkard, etc. Addictive behavior becomes part of the customer's basic sense of identity, your basic sense of being. Changing this sense of identity was crucial for the maintenance of the psychotherapeutic cure. That was the hard part of the treatment. Changing one's basic sense of identity is the most difficult task. The psyche tends to cling to what is old and familiar, which seems more comfortable and psychologically safe than the new and unknown. Professionally, I had the knowledge above and used it daily. However, ironically, it was not ready to apply it to myself, and to the question of my own hesitation in relation to my religious identity. For 43 years my religious identity had been labeled as Christian, though many qualifications could be added to that term over the years. To give up that label of personal identity was no easy task. It was part of how I defined my own being. Looking back, it was clear that my hesitation served the purpose to ensure that I could maintain my family religious identity of being a Christian, although being a Christian who believed like a Muslim. It was the end of December and my wife and I were filling out our forms to get passports Americans, so that a trip to the Middle East could become a reality. One of the questions had to do with religious affiliation. I didn't think about it and I automatically fell back on the old and familiar, and filled in, Christian. It was easy, it was familiar and comfortable. However, that comfort was momentarily interrupted when my wife asked me how I had responded to the question about religious identity on the form. I immediately replied, Christian, and laughs audibly. One of Freud's contributions to the knowledge of the human psyche was his perception that laughter usually it is a release of psychological tension. As wrong as Freud may have stated in many aspects of his theory of psychosexual development, his opinions about laughter were right on target. I had laughed. What was this psychological tension that I needed to release through laughter? I hastened to offer my wife a brief statement that he was a Christian, not a Muslim. In response, she politely informed that she was just asking if I had written Christian, Protestant, or Methodist. Professionally, I knew that a person does not defend himself against an accusation that has not been made. If, in the course of a psychotherapy session, my client shouted, "I'm not angry about this," and I hadn't even talked about the topic of anger, it was clear that my client felt the need to defend himself against an accusation that his own unconsciously did. In short, he was really angry, but he wasn't ready to admit it or deal with it. If my wife hadn't made the accusation, i.e., "You are a Muslim," then the accusation had to come from my unconscious, since I was the only other person present. We're conscious of this, but he continued to hesitate. The religious label that had been glued to my sense of self for 43 years would not come off easily. A month had passed since my wife's question. It was now the end of January 1993. I had set aside all the books on Islam written by Western scholars, because I had read them extensively. The 2 English translations of the meaning the Quran were back on the shelf, and was busy reading a 3rd English translation of the meaning of the Quran. Maybe in this translation I find some sudden justification for. It was my lunchtime private service at a local Arab restaurant that I started frequenting. I walked in as usual, sat down at a small table, and opened my 3rd English translation of the meaning of the Quran where it left off my reading. I thought I could read a little during my lunch break. Moments later I realized that Mahmoud was on my shoulder, waiting to receive my order. He glanced at what I was reading, but he didn't said nothing. My request was made and I returned to the solitude of my reading. A few minutes later, his wife of Mahmoud, Ayman, an American Muslim woman who wore the hijab, headscarf, and modest dress that I have come to associate with Muslim women, brought my request. She commented that I was reading the Quran and politely asked if I was Muslim. The word came out of my mouth before it could be modified by any social etiquette or education. No. That single word came out of shape forced and with more than a touch of irritation. With that, Ayman politely he withdrew from my desk. What was happening me? I had behaved rudely and, in a way, aggressively. Or what had this woman done to deserve this behavior on my part? This it wasn't me. Because of my childhood education, I continued to use sir and madam when I addressed clerks and cashiers who served me in stores. I could pretend to ignore my own laughter as a release of tension, but I couldn't ignore this kind of unconscious behavior coming from myself. My reading was set aside and I mentally reflected on these events during my meal. The more I reflected, the more guilty I felt for my behavior. I knew that when Ayman brought my note at the end of the meal, would have to make certain corrections. If it were for no other reason, simply because education demanded it. In addition, it was really very disturbed by how resistant he had been to his innocuous question. What it was happening to me that I answered a question so violently simple and straightforward? Why did that simple question lead me to this atypical behavior on my part? Later, when Ayman came with my note, I tried to rehearse an apology by saying, "I'm afraid I've been a bit abrupt in answering your question earlier. If you were me asking if I believe there is only one God, then my answer is yes. If you were asking me if I believe that Muhammad was one of the prophets of God, so my answer is yes." She, in a very kind and encouraging way, said, "All right. Some people take longer than others." Perhaps readers are kind enough to note the psychological games it was playing with myself without laughing too much with my mental gymnastics and behavior. I knew very well that, in my own words, I had just said the Shahada, the Islamic testimony of faith, i.e., I testify that there is no God but God and witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. However, when saying this and recognizing what I had said, I could continue to hold on to an old and familiar label of religious identity. After all, I didn't have said he was a Muslim. He was simply a Christian, though a Christian atypical, who was willing to say that there was a God, not a deity, and that he was willing to say that Muhammad was one of the prophets inspired by that God. If a Muslim wanted to accept me as being Muslim, that was his problem, and his label of religious identity. Meanwhile, it wasn't mine. I thought I had found a way out of my crisis of religious identity. It was a Christian who would carefully explain that he agreed with, and was willing to testify to, the Islamic witness of faith. Completed my tortuous explanation and detailed elaboration of the English language, the other they could label me whatever they wanted.